The lands between, shadowed by the luminous Erd Tree and governed by the Empyrean Queen Marika the Eternal, servant of the Greater Will and vessel of the Elden Ring. But history is rarely so straightforward, and without the ebb and flow of political struggles, war, and heartache, until an age of peace and prosperity finally settle in. To make sense of the world we Tarnished are beckoned back to, we must start at the very beginning, before even the sprouting of the Erd Tree, which shifts our focus to the outer gods. And while we're unsure of exactly how many of them there are, and how they each attempt to meddle in the affairs of our realm, we only need to focus on one for now: the outer god known as the Greater Will. Long ago, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, which would later become the Elden Ring. The power of the Greater Will and the Elden Ring combined would be capable of a great many things. One being the creation of the Erd Tree, formed from primordial matter. A grand and radiant tree that would bestow upon the land between's inhabitants its golden aura of grace, its power sourced from the Elden Ring. Also, through the assistance of the Greater Will, Queen Marika would rise to rule the lands between, and was made the vessel of the Elden Ring itself. The Golden Order was established and the age of the Erd Tree had begun. But this age was born amid conflict, as the Golden Order sought to expand the influence of the Greater Will. To bolster her position, Queen Marika took a consort, a great warrior by the name of Hoarah, who, in becoming Marika's husband and subsequently the first Elden Lord, changed his name to Godfrey. In his vow to become a lord, Godfrey took upon his back the Lord of Beasts Serash, to guide him and to suppress the ceaseless lust for battle that raged within his past self. But opposition to the Erd Tree was widespread in the beginning, and it would only become the embodiment of order through countless victories in war. And Godfrey was the lord of the battlefield, and would bring them many victories. But the Golden Order wouldn't hold the lands between through war alone. Marika needed to ensure that their rule and their order didn't end with her. To this end, she struck with more than a single strategy. With Godfrey as her husband, they would start the Golden Lineage, bringing 3 demigod children into the world. There was Godwyn the Golden, and born graceless with horns adorning their heads were the cursed Omen twins Morgott and Mohg, who were imprisoned and kept underground, hidden from the rest of the world. But a lineage is only as good for as long as it lasts. Marika wished for herself and the demigods to have a life eternal. Legend says that the Empyreans have wolves for shadows, and Queen Marika was no exception to these shadow-bound beasts. Malekith, the Blackblade, was the shadow-bound to Marika, and she used her shadow for a sole purpose: to seal away destined death. Malekith was a loyal half-brother to Queen Marika, and would imbue destined death within his blade to seal it from the world. And with death sealed, Marika and the demigods could live that life eternal. The Order would soon clash with seemingly their most dangerous foe, standing in the way of the lands between being completely under their influence. This was the war against the Giants, led by Lord Godfrey. The Giants held control over the Flame of Ruin atop one of their snowy peaks, a flame that certainly possessed the power to burn the Erd Tree to the ground, and the Golden Order could simply not ignore that looming threat, especially considering that the Giants were mortal enemies of the Erd Tree. But the Order would and could not be stopped, and the Giants were defeated despite borrowing power of a fell god to aid in their fight. With their victory over the giants won, Queen Marika would soon learn that the flame of ruin from the giant's forge would never die. So instead, Marika inflicted a curse upon the fire giant, so that he would have to tend to this flame for eternity. With the future of the Golden Order cemented, and the last threat to the Erdtree quelled, Marika set her sights to continue expanding the influence of the Greater Will within the Lands Between. This sight would bring war to the region of Lorinia, home to the Sorcery Academy of Rhea Lucaria and the Carian royal family. The head of both the Academy and the royal family was a woman named Renala, an extremely talented sorceress whose lunar magic marked her as the Academy's champion and later its master. She would also go on to establish the House of Caria as royalty. To lead the upcoming battle for Lorinia, Marika would send Radagon at the head of a great golden host. But Radagon is an incredibly interesting character, so much so that it warrants a brief explanation apart from the story. In truth, Radagon was Marika, and Marika was Radagon. They were one and the same. They are two beings residing within one god. This we can learn by casting the Law of Regression incantation in front of Radagon's statue in the Leyendale royal capital to reveal its secrets. Now, there are still unknowns in regards to this revelation. What we do know is that Radagon and Marika were absolutely two separate physical beings. Now, whether they were two beings with a single unified consciousness, or if they each had their own independent from one another, or where things aren't entirely clear. But I believe that the way the story unfolds points to the latter. However, it was important for me to relay that information to you now, so that when I said Marika split Radagon off from herself to lead their army into Lorinia, you wouldn't be confused. The Golden Order's invasion into Lorinia would end up being a successful one, but not through the means that they had expected. When Radagon did meet Lady Renala in battle, he would soon after repent his territorial aggressions, swear his love to Renala, and take the Carian Queen's hand in marriage. The Golden Order and the Fate of the Moon were conjoined, and through this union the influence of the Greater Will would preside over Lorinia, uniting the provinces of the Lands Between. It is unclear exactly how long this marriage would last, but it would last long enough for them to have 3 demigod children of their own. Their children were General Radon, Praetor Rykard, and Lunar Princess Rani, who was the only Empyrean to be born of the royal lineage thus far. Time would go on, and the Lands Between maintained the order of the Greater Will. But tragedy would fall upon Lord Godfrey. After all of the battles he had led and won, after all of the great enemies he had felled, he would face the Stormlord alone, and fell even him. But then there came a moment when his last worthy enemy fell. It is said that that is when the hue of grace from Lord Godfrey's eyes faded. But in truth he was robbed of his grace by Queen Marika, and for what reason isn't entirely clear. But it wasn't just Godfrey whom she divested of grace, but of his warriors too. Consider this dialogue from Melina as she speaks the words of Marika herself.
My lord, and thy warriors, I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the Lands Between. Ye will wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die.
It was then that Godfrey and his warriors, robbed of their grace, became tarnished, and were exiled from the Lands Between. Godfrey would lead his kinsfolk from the Lands Between in what would be known as the Long March. And when it came to an end, Godfrey divested himself of kingship and became a simple warrior once more. With Godfrey banished, Radagon would leave Rennala to return to Marika and become her consort, as well as the second Elden Lord. But before he left, Radagon bequeathed upon Rennala an amber egg containing a great rune. The departure of her husband left Rennala heartbroken, and it was then that those at the Academy realized that she was no champion after all. The Academy rebelled against the Carian royal family and locked Rennala away within the Grand Library, where she was left alone, cradling the amber egg. Upon Radagon's return to Marika, they would conceive 2 more children, the twins Malenia and Miquella, born of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but each suffered afflictions from birth. Miquella was afflicted with eternal childhood, while Malenia harbored rot within. Time would continue to go on. The 2 fingers were envoys to the Greater Will, and thus with their finger maidens sought a candidate to one day succeed Queen Marika and become the new god of the coming age. Malenia, Miquella, and Ranni, the only demigods that could claim the title of Empyrean, were the only natural choices. But Ranni would not acquiesce to the 2 fingers. She would instead take another direction, leading us to the Night of the Black Knives. In conspiring with the Black Knife assassins, Ranni stole the Rune of Death from Malekith, and through ritual imbued the assassins' blades with its power. And in the Night of the Black Knives, with their death-imbued blades, the assassins murdered Godwyn the Golden, bringing the first taste of death to the demigods. But in truth, 2 demigods perished that night. While Godwyn was murdered and perished in soul, Ranni was the first demigod whose flesh would perish. But Ranni did not die. She slew her own Empyrean flesh, as to not be controlled by the fate the Greater Will had planned for her. She would instead house her soul into a doll modeled after the Snow Witch that had once mentored her. The Golden Order had been struck a devastating blow, the death of one of their own. Malekith would bind his blade of destined death within his own flesh, so that none might ever rob death again. He'd then disguise himself and take on another identity, perhaps to safeguard death that much more. Godwyn, the first dead of the demigods, would be taken and buried beneath the capital at the roots of the Erd Tree. But this would ultimately spell more trouble for the Golden Order, as the power of the Rune of Death would spread from Godwyn's wound into the roots of the Erd Tree. This would later spread the Rune of Death across the lands between through the roots and sprouting the death roots throughout the realm. And in turn, these roots would give rise to those who live in death. Yet another plight in the defiance of the Greater Will. Heartbroken over the loss of her child, Queen Marika would soon become disillusioned with the Greater Will. And in her grief, driven to the brink, she would bring her hammer down and shatter the Elden Ring. And while Radagon simultaneously attempted to repair it, his endeavor would be in vain. The Elden Ring was shattered.
Marika is the vessel of the Elden Ring, carrier of its vision, a god in truth. But after the Elden Ring's shattering, she was imprisoned in the Erd Tree, a grim punishment for shattering the Order, despite her godhood. The fingers speak. Marika's trespass demanded a heavy sentence. But even in shackles, she remains a god and the vision's vessel.
With the Elden Ring shattered and Marika imprisoned, everything within the lands between was turned upside down. The great runes, shattered pieces of the Elden Ring, were claimed by Marika's offspring, demigods all. But the mad taint of their newfound power would trigger a war, the Shattering. A war in which sibling would raise armies against one another. A war in which there could be no victory. But not every demigod would fight. Some would claim their great runes and turn their attention to different goals. Rykard would take the form of a giant serpent, so that he might devour, grow, and live eternally. He spent his time devouring countless heroes that would become a part of him, in hopes that they would all one day together devour the very gods. Other demigods, like Godric the Grafted, had quite different ideas on how to conduct themselves.
Honestly, Godric's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. First, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Radahn in that castle. Then he insulted Melania, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots.
But even when the mightiest demigods, General Radahn and Melania, met in battle, still none would leave the victor. They would leave nothing but devastation and rot in their wake, poisoning the land of Caelid. None would claim the title of Elden Lord. So all they had gained was a fractured world and the abandonment of the greater will.
The greater will has long renounced the demigods. Tarnished, show no mercy. Have their heads. Take all they have left.
During the ensuing chaos of the Shattering, the twin Omen brothers Morgott and Mohg, once banished beneath the capital, found their escape. Though each brother would have vastly different ideas on how they would spend their newfound freedom. Morgott, though he was never loved by the Greater Will or the Erd Tree, still loved it all the same, and dedicated himself to becoming its protector, and would become the rightful king of the Leyndell capital. Mohg would put his faith in a different outer god altogether, the Formless Mother, who showed him the strength in his accursed blood. To this end, Mohg would steal Miquella away from his Halig tree while in his cocoon form. He wished to raise Miquella to full godhood so that he could become his consort and take on the role of monarch. But he would ultimately never receive a response from the young Empyrean, regardless of how much of his bloody bedchamber he shared. The world was in turmoil, broken and bruised. The Greater Will had abandoned the demigods, just as they had broken the tenets of the Golden Order during the Shattering. To restore the Golden Order, the Greater Will extended its grace back to the once exiled Tarnished, so that grace might grant them life and lead them back through the fog into the lands between, to be guided by the Two Fingers, to rid the demigods of their great runes and stand before the Elden Ring after conferring great runes and becoming the Elden Lord, joining Queen Marika as her consort and restoring the Golden Order and the lands between. But there are many ways to repair the Elden Ring, and many factions who wish to do so to restore the world in a new image, no longer under the influence of the Erd Tree. And so it all comes down to the Tarnished who would become the next Elden Lord. Will you make the world anew, conferring great runes bestowed upon you by the would-be blasphemers? Or will you restore the Golden Order through the guidance of the Two Fingers? Inherit the broken lands between, and make your choice, ye Tarnished, ye dead who yet live. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and click the bell icon to get notified for all the new Elden Ring lore videos. Follow me on Twitter for reasons, and if you want to engage in the community and talk lore, play games together, and be part of exclusive giveaways, be sure to join my community Discord. Links for all these things can be found down in the description below.